السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد، قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم والوالدين والأقربين. O you who believe, be insistent in standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even against yourselves, or your parents, or your relatives. Thank you very much for having me today and giving me the opportunity to speak. My topic is quite simple. It's about diversity and differences of opinion in law, in fiqh, and in belief in aqaid for Shia Muslims. And the reason I want to talk about this topic that's a long-standing feature within Shia Islam, this idea of diversity, is because nowadays we're seeing a really worrying feature where those who have differences of opinion are being attacked. Those who have views that are different from the majority are being trying to be crushed in different ways. And we are seeing those who are trying to crush these dissenting voices. That means high-ranking scholars are being accused of misleading others, being indeed. They're accused of trying to say they're changing the religion or trying to destroy our faith. They're being told we should be banned from our centers. They're told that somebody claims it was a spy to the British government. This is the type of attack that is happening for people with dissenting voices, people with differences of opinion. And my argument today, the examples I want to give today, will hopefully demonstrate to everybody in this room and anybody listening that the idea of differences of opinion, whether in our faith, whether in our aqaid, whether in the way that we think about our faith, is a long-standing feature of Shia Islam. It is something that we should celebrate, not something that we should crush. It is something that we should respect, not something that we should try and push away. And if we look at our idea of Shia Islam as Shia Muslims, we are the minority in our faith. The Shia Muslims are a minority amongst Muslims. And we also know, look, the Prophet ﷺ, in his message, there were others who are trying to crush him. They were trying to shut down his message. Why? Because they believed that they could, by crushing his message, by stopping him, they would be able to be successful in stopping his message and his ideas. What do we think? None of us would say it is right to stop the Prophet. None of us would say it's right to stop those who have differences of opinion at that time when it's the Prophet. The Shia Muslims throughout time have been oppressed and pushed aside in many ways. And we always argue, and rightly, that the minority can and should be listened to. You don't have to agree with everything, but at least you should have the ability to respect the other. And so what we're going to see through the arguments I'm going to make today is how full our Shia history is of these examples, where scholars have attacked others for their poor arguments but still retained respect, and they haven't tried to cancel them, they haven't tried to stop them propagating their views as we see today. And instead, difference of opinion is part and parcel of our Shia history. This is what I want to emphasize today. Let me start with something which the late Ayatollah Khomeini said. He said, the books of the great fuqaha of Islam are filled with differences of opinion. In some issues, there is even the consensus, the ijma' of the scholars. But even on these issues, there sometimes is an opinion against that consensus. Can we imagine that those who had a difference of opinion were working against Allah and against Islam and the truth? Never. Because very often scholars have these differences of opinion. And just by having a difference of opinion doesn't mean that they were working against Allah. Doesn't mean that they're spies. Doesn't mean any of these things. In fact, the opposite is the case. It should be respected. And what we will see is actually sometimes that minority opinion, which is maybe sometimes only one person against the consensus of everyone, that one person's view 1,000 years ago has become the view of every scholar today. And if that person had been crushed, maybe we wouldn't have the Shia Islam we have today. So what we'll see is, I want to give through examples. I don't want to just say this stuff. You will hear people talk about this quite a lot. I want to prove this to you. I want to show you example after example to demonstrate how actually these differences of opinion, this diversity, is a core feature of Shia Islam in particular. We often talk about how the doors of ijtihad have never been closed in Shia Islam. Let us, inshallah, keep those doors open. Let us encourage that diversity of opinion. And so I'm going to cover 4 main areas. Firstly, usul al-fiqh, the principles that underpin our Islamic law. Secondly, models of deriving fiqh, and I'll touch on that and what I mean by that in a second. Thirdly, fiqh itself, and these laws, the Islamic laws that we follow. And that's going to be the main focus where I'll give the most examples. And finally, belief, aqaid. So for each of these areas, I'm going to show how there have been fundamentally different opinions in our history, and how a minority view has become a majority view, and sometimes vice versa. And sometimes that has become our view today. And therefore, crushing that dissent at that time would have been wrong. And so crushing that dissent today is also wrong. So let's start with usul al-fiqh. I'm going to cover, there are lots of areas where we can cover this in many, many different ways. But I want to talk about one issue on usul al-fiqh. And that is this concept of hujjiyat khabr al-wahid al-thiqa. So the authoritativeness. Can we rely on a narration that has people in the chain who are considered to be reliable, thiqa, a sahih narration? Can we rely on that narration? That's the question I want to ask. Because and can we rely on it if there are even 10 of these narrations, but they don't reach the level of what is called tawatur? If it does not reach the level of tawatur, can we rely on that narration? In our history, this concept has been hugely controversial. But today, almost every single scholar, with a couple of exceptions, believes we have to rely on these narrations for the vast majority of the laws that we believe today. In the early days, however, most Shia scholars said that using these types of narrations is not allowed at all. It's not allowed. If you use these narrations, you're doing something wrong. Ibn Abi Aqil did not consider it valid. Sheikh Mufid, one of the biggest scholars of our time, of that time, did not consider it valid. And he actually accused others of qiyas, which in those days would have been quite a bad accusation. He accused Ibn Junayd of that. Same with Sharif al-Murtada. These are some of the biggest scholars of our history, and they said we cannot use hadith other than the ones that reach the level of tawatur. We cannot use hadith generally to derive our law. Just imagine, these are the biggest scholars of our past. Sheikh Tosi, however, turned it around. He said, actually, you can use these narrations. But then Ibn Idris afterwards said, no, you shouldn't use these narrations. And then Muhaqqiq al-Hilli and Alama Hilli later on decided and developed a methodology of usul al-fiqh where the usage of these narrations was very core and core of that thinking. From that time till Sheikh Ansari, where there was certain development, that has been the core opinion amongst Shia scholarship, with certain changes when it comes to the akhbaris and usulis, which I won't go into in detail. Now, what am I seeing? What am I telling you here? The fundamental of how we derive our law, the idea of using narrations that do not reach the level of tawatur, these are the fundamentals. These are the reason, the way that our fiqh is derived today. There has not been consensus throughout our Shia history that we can use them. In fact, there have been people who said you cannot use them, you should not use them, and have been very, very upset at those who would use them. So on the very, very core of how our fiqh is derived, there's been differences of opinion through time. One time consensus thinking one time the consensus thinking the exact opposite. And this is on the fundamentals of how we use our narrations to derive our law. And nowadays, almost all scholars say, actually, you have to use these narrations. There's no other way of deriving rules. We have some exceptions. The illustrious, the famous, the well-respected Sheikh Haydar Hubbullah is a brilliant man who, if you haven't had the chance to meet, please have the chance, inshallah. He is a brilliant man who's widely respected across the hawzas in Qom and across the world. He has a similar view to some of these ancient scholars. And he is one of the scholars apparently attacked as being a spy. Okay, so it's very important to recognize that you can have some different views, which are quite fundamentally different from others, and that is actually very similar to our scholars in history. Let's think about another topic, my second area, which is how you do taqleed. So the way that we do taqleed right now is actually relatively recent in the last couple of 100 years, post Sheikh Ansari. That's where the current model basically comes from. But many scholars have toyed with different ideas. No, I'm not saying that any of these are right. I'm not saying that at all. But what we have is a group of scholars who have formed what they've called the International Center for Collective Ijtihad. It's a concept that many people will disagree with. But their view is that scholars should come together to discuss topics of fiqh, for example, share their research, and where they agree, they should say, this is where we agree. And where they disagree, they should say, this is where we disagree. And lay out their rationale. So they should publish joint views on these topics. Why? Because it gives them the opportunity to work together, to come as a council of scholars to come up to an idea. And they won't always agree. Yeah? By coming together doesn't mean you agree, but they come together and they say, look, let's put our research together, and this is what we think. And this is where we disagree, and this is where we agree. How many of you, or how many of, I can speak for myself, have asked the question, especially when I was younger, why can't our scholars just come together one day and agree what the first day of Eid is? And that's a question that many people ask. There are many reasons why that's the case. But is coming together so wrong where they publish their istidlal, their rationale as to why they come together? Is that really that difficult? Is that something that is so fundamental because they choose a slightly different model of doing things and sharing their research? Is that so wrong? And this center has therefore been accused of being a bastion of British government and spies and stuff like that. Like, do we really think that just because you have a different view of doing things that you should be attacked in that way? These are people, the people involved in this are Sheikh Haydar Hubbullah, who I mentioned, Ayatollah Muhaqqiq Damad, one of the huge scholars in Qom, Sheikh Arif, Dr. Fanai, Sayyid Fatimi, and Dr. Kumal Rajani. These aren't bit part scholars. These are people who have worked the whole of their lives in this topic. And you may disagree with them. I disagree with them on topics. But just publishing their research, coming together and doing that, is that warranting? Does that merit this level of attack? What I'm saying here is doing things slightly differently, having differences of opinion, is part and parcel of our history. Now, let's talk about fiqh, which is, I think, the core of it, and it gives the best insight into what I've talked about, because that has wide-ranging implications on the daily life of many of us. I'm going to try and give only a few examples. I'll start with an example of a ruling that's become the mainstream position today, but it was never a majority opinion amongst Shias in the past. So this is the idea of the ritual purity or impurity of the Ahlul Kitab. So what's the popular opinion today? Most people will say, and most maraja today will be very clear, the Ahlul Kitab are ritually pure, they're tahir, right? In fact, but what we have to realize is that only a few hundred years ago, Ayatollah Bihbahani, who was an instrumental figure in the usuli way of thinking that we have today, one of the most illustrious scholars of his age, he considered the idea that Ahlul Kitab are impure as one of the signs or slogans of the Shia. Muhammad Hassan Zamani, on his book on the topic, he cited 40 prominent Shia jurists who advocated the opinion that the Ahlul Kitab were ritually impure. But what happened? It took one scholar in particular, Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim, who came and he said, actually, I've done my research, I've looked at what's here, and I've come to a different conclusion. I've come to the conclusion that actually these narrations that have been interpreted in a certain way by our scholars of the past, I respect them, but I disagree with them. And actually, the Ahlul Kitab are tahir in my view. Ayatollah Muhsin al-Hakim said this. And after he advocated that, since that time, it has now become almost unanimous, or a significant majority, if not unanimity, amongst our Shia scholars today,
that actually the Ahlul Kitab are tahir. So because of that one scholar going against the majority opinion, against everyone's opinion, he stood up and made a different viewpoint heard. He wasn't crushed. In fact, his view has become the majority view and the mainstream view today. Again, clear example of how that happens. Similarly, when conditions change, sometimes you might have narrations which seem very, very clear to you. Yet, what we see is that it might look clear, but in reality, scholars have different views. And so what you'll see is when a scholar has a different view, someone might come to you with a hadith saying, look at this scholar, he's wrong. Look at this hadith, it shows he's wrong. But that is a very, very simplistic view. Let's look at one example. Let's look at the example of chess. Okay? As most people will know, chess, even when it's not used for the purpose of gambling, is considered impermissible by many, many scholars. And it has been by the vast majority of scholars, if not as a consensus in our history. Why is that? Because there's some hadith which are very clear. Imam Ali alayhi salam is reported to have said, the chess and the dice, they're both considered gambling. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is reported to have said, and these are all reports, they're all hadith, and we'll talk about the value of them in a second. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is reported to have said, the Messenger of God did not allow people to play chess and dice. But today, or recently, Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, said that playing chess is fine as long as there's no gambling involved. And in a letter to Ayatollah Qadiri, he said, he explained his rationale and explained why he thought it was very clear. And that view is a view that is now held by Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, Ayatollah Fadlullah, Ayatollah Thani, a number of contemporary Marajat today. But what happened? One or two scholars with a different view, despite there being hadith which look very clear saying one thing, they've come up with another view, which is now quite a mainstream view and not something that's considered to be a shadh or rare opinion. Actually, it's quite a reasonable opinion and held by many. And so just because there are these hadith which appear to be wrong, might point to a certain way, don't believe necessarily that means that they're right. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. A different context might mean it means something else. Other hadith which imply the opposite might also exist. And scholars might come up to different conclusions and different opinions. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the idea of moon sighting. I talked about this earlier. And right in the early days, of course, people would have taken the view that whoever sees the moon with their eye, that would mean that the next day would be the first of the next month. And we know the challenges of Ramadan and Eid on this topic. But then what happened? Ayatollah Khomeini has this idea of sharing the night. The idea that if the moon is sighted in one place, in any other place that shares the night with that person, they can follow that sighting, as long as it is a reliable sighting. Now, what happened with that? Was that a mainstream opinion? That was against the mainstream opinion. It was a very different opinion. This is one of our big scholars of our recent times. And he had a view massively different from everybody else. Not only is it massively different, if you think about the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Imams alayhi salam, if you think about their time, they didn't have the ability to look at South America and know that the moon was sighted there. So as far as they're concerned, the day that they did Eid or started Ramadan might have been the day after someone who followed this share the night ruling. Just imagine, this is something so fundamental. And Ayatollah Khomeini, one of the biggest scholars of our recent times, had a view that you can have a different, the times have changed, there is the ability to have this slightly different opinion. And he wouldn't have used the times have changed argument, he would have used his interpretation of the rules. But the ability to actually implement that is only something we can do recently. And Ayatollah Khomeini has been able to come to that conclusion. And so, if you look at all of these, there's so many types of these examples where you have scholars who've abandoned the majority position, completely said the majority position, or even the consensus of the scholars is wrong, and then taken a minority opinion, which has then become quite a major opinion in our society. Let's give another example. The idea of organ donation. The majority opinion today remains the case that it is allowed to take the organs of a non-Muslim for a Muslim, but it is haram to take the organs of a Muslim for a non-Muslim. Let me repeat that. It is allowed to take the organ of a non-Muslim with their permission, to implant it and to donate it to a Muslim, but it is haram for a Muslim, for us, to donate our organs if a non-Muslim will get it. The discrimination is clear. That is the majority view of our scholars today. That you can take from non-Muslims, we cannot give to non-Muslims when it comes to our organs. And there's lots of rationale, and I can explain that rationale for those who are interested. But there are some scholars who have actually said, no, that's not the case. There are minority opinion. It's very, very few scholars who have this opinion. But there are these scholars who have this opinion that actually, as much as you can give to non-Muslims, as much as you can take from non-Muslims, you can also give your organs to non-Muslims because that will save their life. But what am I saying here? Again, it is a minority opinion today which is being massively criticized, but it doesn't need to be criticized. And that's the point I want to get to. Similarly, on the permissibility of playing cards. Similarly, on the idea of charging interest on business loans. There have been consensus on these topics for a long time, but now we're starting to see scholars who have slightly different views on these areas. And we've seen these individual scholars who are now praised as some of the biggest scholars and, very, very much thought of in a very positive light, even though at the time they were criticized and attacked. And so let me talk about a couple of these big, big scholars of our past. Let's talk about someone like Ibn Junayd al-Iskafi. He was one of those Shia scholars who didn't agree with what his predecessors said. And he said things like, it's makruh to touch the Quran in the state of janaba instead of haram. He said the khums is distributed into two shares, one for the imam and the other for anyone who's in need of it, not Sayyid or non-Sayyid. He says that a wife inherits from their husband capital aspects like land, and you can see this from Jawahir al-Kalam and others. These were opinions that were very, very much completely different from everyone at that time. But if today we look back at those scholars, we say, wow, it was great that Ibn Junayd had these views. It was great that he had this singular view which was different from everyone else. Think also of Ibn Idris al-Hilli. He extensively criticized the fatwa of Sheikh Tusi. So what you had, for those who know the history, after Sheikh Tusi, he was such a big scholar. His viewpoint and the way that he set things up was so well respected that for decades or even a century, all the scholars just followed what Sheikh Tusi said, just did similar things. Maybe little changes here or there, but basically followed his school, his way of thinking. It took someone like Ibn Idris al-Hilli who took a very different view. He criticized the views and the fatwa of Sheikh Tusi, who had dominated these views for a century. And you could argue he's an opponent of Sheikh Tusi in many ways. And he actually accused Sheikh Tusi of having opinions that were against how Shia legal systems should think. But that was the ability that they could have these differences of opinion that was so robust, so strong. Were they cancelled? Were they called spies? Were they attacked? Were letters written against them banning them from speaking and writing? No. But today we have this. But our history celebrates this. In fact, one of the things that when you talk to scholars about the big value of Shia Islam, why is Shia Islam so good? One of the arguments that you'll hear from our Shia scholars, our ulama, our maraja, you can speak to them, they'll say, it's because we have had ijtihad in our hands. We have all of our scholars are not allowed to just follow the scholars of the past. They have to do their own striving. They have to do ijtihad. That's why we're called mujtahid. They have to do ijtihad. They have to strive to find what the law is. At every age, they have to do it themselves. That is very much a core feature, a tenet of our Shia thinking. And therefore, they can come up with different views. They can have fundamentally different views. And it shouldn't be, even though it is, it shouldn't be criticized and attacked and silenced and crushed or attempted to be crushed in the way that some are trying in recent times. Muqaddas al-Dabili, he is someone who's been given the title of Muqaddas because of the honor that he's had, and he opposed so many fatwa of the previous jurists. He suggested, for example, that alcohol is tahir. Of course, you shouldn't drink it. It's haram. You can't drink it. But he said it was tahir. It's a similar view to what Ayatollah Fadlullah has had before he passed. Later Ayatollah Fadlullah had. He had the view very early on compared, he died in about 500-600 years ago. He had the view that a woman can be a judge, which in those days was quite a big thing. And he had that view without a problem. And it's interesting that you can have, if someone has some of those, what we would consider to be weird views today on these issues, they get massively criticized. Let's look at a couple of other examples. Permanent marriage to Ahl al-Kitab. So marrying a man marrying a woman who's part of the Ahl al-Kitab. Sharif al-Murtada, Sheikh Tusi, Alama Hilli said it was haram. Sheikh Saduq ibn Abi Qil said it was halal. Again, big scholars on one side, other scholars saying something else. These are some of our biggest scholars of our past. What about the time of Maghrib, which is coming up soon? Sharif al-Murtada, Ibn al-Junayd, Ibn Idris, Sheikh Mufid said it was at sunset. Others, including Allama Hilli, and the majority of you today, says no, you have to wait until the redness comes up, as a matter of ihtiyat wajib, depending on different scholars. So what you can see from, I've only touched a few examples here, but the examples I've got show that minority opinions in our fiqh have become common and have become the majority opinion. And these are from major scholars of our history. Nobody can argue about these things. These are not tiny scholars who nobody will respect. These are big scholars who everybody will agree with are big and reasonable scholars and major scholars of our history. And they had these robust discussions. They had very different views. But was there this crushing of dissent? There wasn't. And instead, this idea of having that individual minority opinion against the majority really adds to our heritage, adds to the strength of our faith, and actually has become our very faith today. And finally, I want to touch on one area, which is this idea of aqaid and our history. And firstly, we should know, obviously, on issues of belief, as Ayatollah Sistani says, it is necessary for a Muslim to believe in the fundamentals of faith with their own insight and understanding, and they can't follow anyone in this respect. You can't just accept the word of another who knows simply because they've said it. And that view, and that's a mainstream view that everyone will agree, it's in the Islamic laws book, the first ruling there, and it's the main view across all the maraja. So it's our duty as communities, it's our duty as individuals, and the duty of scholars to educate communities on the issues of our belief, because everyone themselves has to reach those conclusions. And what I want to lay out here a little bit is even on issues of our belief, even on issues of aqaid, there have been differences of opinion through our history. Let me give a few examples, okay? And we can talk about them in detail for those who are interested. Were the Imams martyred or did they die a natural death? An important issue. Sheikh Saduq said that all the Imams were killed and therefore martyred. But Sayyid Murtada said only Imam Ali, Imam Hassan and Hussein and the 7th Imam were killed, with the cause of the 8th Imam, Imam Ali Rada, being not certain. And he said that there's no evidence that the rest of the Imams were actually martyred. So this concept, which is quite an important concept about were our Imams killed or not, massive difference of opinion amongst major scholars of our past. What about the infallibility of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What about that? Again, there's been differences of opinion in our past. There have been some Shia scholars who believe in the unconditional infallibility of the Prophet, which includes not just rulings and the fiqh, but also the subject matter as well and the context around. And other scholars, including major scholars of our recent history, said that the tradition suggesting that the Prophet is not able to commit any mistakes are only related to fiqh, the actual rules of fiqh, not broader context. People have different views on this question throughout our history. The idea of who Abasa wa Tawalla is referring to, the idea of he frowned and he turned away. There are different scholars, different mufassirin from history who have different views on who that is and why that can be acceptable or not. But does this mean if you have a different belief on some of these issues, the idea of the Mi'raj, was it a physical experience, the view of Shaykh Tusi, Shaykh Tabarsi, Allama Majlisi and others? Was it a spiritual experience like Abu al-Sina? Was it a physical journey in the early stage from Makkah to Al-Aqsa and then a spiritual journey onwards, which Allama Tabatabai says? Difference of opinion. Lots of differences of opinion. In fact, what I think here is quite valuable to see is Allama Mamqani. He's one of the big scholars of the early 20th century, who died in 1933. He said that one of the biggest, he wrote one of the biggest works on Ilm al-Rijal. And he said, today, many of the beliefs in respect to the status of the Imams that are considered amongst the fundamental tenets of our Shia faith used to be considered amongst the heretic, extremist, ghulu beliefs. This is what one of the biggest scholars of our time says. So what am I saying here? It can happen. The beliefs the majority view on what our belief is can change through time. So what am I trying to get to at the end here? That whether it's in Usul al-Fiqh, whether it's in the model of how you derive your fiqh, whether it's on issues of your fiqh, of your laws, whether it's on the issues of your aqaid, of your belief, we have had difference of opinion in our Shia history from the biggest scholars of those times and of those eras. They have said fundamentally different things at different times. This is a feature, this is a long-standing feature, this idea of difference of opinion. It's actually a jewel of our crown of the Shia beliefs. And you don't have to believe this difference of opinion today when we see it. You may say, no, actually, I believe the traditional view on this topic is this, and I believe it. That's the view that I hold, and I agree with it. Of course, that's what the marja I follow says. But what does that mean? Does that mean when someone comes up with that different opinion, they should be crushed? Does it mean that they should be attacked? Does it mean they should be called Dal Mudil or Zindiq? Does it mean that that person should be called a spy? Or should we try and encourage and celebrate those people who have difference of opinion? Should we not try and encourage them to think independently and use the skills that are in front of them, the ijtihad that they have, to get to an opinion, to reach a conclusion that is genuinely their view? Should we encourage that or should we crush it? Because remember, that minority opinion today, that one opinion, one person who has that view which might be different to everybody else, in 50 years' time may become the majority view, or the view of all our scholars at some point in future. And so sometimes, and I come back to what I spoke about right at the beginning and the Quranic verse that I said at the beginning, sometimes we have to stand up for justice, stand in solidarity with those who get attacked. We need to stand up and reform our community so that they don't attack. Islah. What is the concept? We're here in the days of Muharram. Islah, the concept of Islah and what Imam Hussein alayhi salam was there to do. Islah of his ummah. Reform, or whatever word you want to use to translate Islah in this way. We have to think about, do we want to stand on the side of justice? Do we want to stand on those who are on the side of those who are being oppressed? Do we want to stand on the side of those who are doing ijtihad and striving towards the truth, even if it may not be the same idea that you may agree with? Even if they are lonely in their opinion, do you want to be with the person do you want to stand on the side of that lonely person when they are trying to have that minority opinion? And so that hopefully gives you a short view, a whistle-stop tour of a large number of our scholars of history and this concept of diversity and difference of opinion in our Shia history. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. And inshallah, it's something that we can all learn from. And I ask Allah's forgiveness if I've made any mistakes. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we're all able to follow the footsteps of our Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bi thinaik. Alayka minni salamullahi abadan ma baqit wa baqiya al-layl wa an-nahar. Wa la ja'ala Allahu akhir al-ahdi minni li ziyaratikum. Assalamu ala al-Husayn وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. الفاتحة.